An unusual thing happened in the newspapers today. Most of the newspapers in our countries ran the same headline, and those headlines referenced God. Well, what was that about? Why? It's because yesterday, Diego Maradona died at the age of 60, the world-renowned football player. And Maradona was known as a bit of a god on the football pitch because of his unbelievable ability. And in the 1986 World Cup, he famously scored a goal with his hand, which was counted and not seen by the referee as a problem. And since then, that was referenced as the hand of God. And now that he's died, all the newspapers came up with the same pun. Into God's hands, we place Maradona. You'll see some of those headlines above my shoulder. Well, firstly, let me say I'm very sorry to hear that he died. I think that, at the age of 60, he was somewhat young. He was not a well person, but as someone who loves football, I was upset to hear that he died, and it's not a happy thing when a person dies. Nonetheless, what does it mean to be placed into God's hands, or for us to think of Maradona as being placed into God's hands? Some people will say, some Christians will say that actually it's not so good news, that if God is judge, then for Maradona to be placed into his hands, that is going to be a difficult encounter. Maradona lived a complicated life, but he could squander his wealth and his talent. He spent his money on things that were not good, like drugs, and he was not faithful to his wife. He was a womanizer. Others will say, no, God is merciful. And actually, as we place Maradona into God's hands, we remember that God will have mercy on him too, because he was a broken person who was put under an immense amount of pressure, and people used and manipulated him as well. Was he a saint or was he a sinner? He was a mixture of both. Actually, we can't speculate, and we don't know exactly what it is to be placed into God's hands. We leave that over to God. The challenge is that we have to think about it for ourselves, and we have to put our own house in order, because one day we will be placed into God's hands. We will be given back to our Creator. Are you ready? If you were to die tomorrow, and the newspaper headlines the day afterwards say that you were placed into God's hands, how would that go? In this season of Advent, we prepare for Christmas. We wait for an encounter with God. It's part of what this season does, allows us to think about waiting and what it would be like to meet God. One day that will happen to all of us, sooner rather than later, who knows? And I guess I want to know, are you ready? And if you're not, and you feel troubled by the question, then the good news is Christmas coming when we get a Saviour.